She was already moving by the time he said her name. Not fast enough. She had done this calculation so many times in Lagos that it had become a kind of muscle memory. The exact number of steps between where she was standing and the nearest exit, the nearest person with a phone, the nearest crowd dense enough to disappear into. She had trained herself out of the habit in Seoul, a little more each week for 6 months, because the whole point of coming here was to stop doing that calculation everywhere she went. She had almost managed it. Then she heard his voice in a covered market 3 streets from her apartment, and every piece of that training collapsed in the space of a breath. "Chisum," he said it quietly, the way he always had when he wanted her to understand that what came next was her own fault for making it necessary. She kept walking. He caught her wrist before she made it 2 more steps, and the people around her did what people do when a man and a woman are having what looks from the outside like a domestic argument. They looked somewhere else. She did not cry out. She had stopped doing that years ago because it never helped. She said, very quietly, "Let go." He did not. Then a voice came from behind him. Let go of her arm. It was not a loud voice. It was the opposite of a loud voice. It was the kind of voice that did not need volume because it had not had to raise itself in a long time. Emeka turned. The man standing 2 meters behind him was unremarkable in every way that Emeka understood as relevant. Average height, plain dark jacket, no visible security, no raised chin or planted stance. He was not holding anything. He was not even particularly close. He looked like a man who had paused on his way through the market to say something that did not concern him, which was exactly what Emeka decided was happening. Emeka almost smiled. "Mind your business." The man said nothing for a moment. Then he put his hand into his jacket pocket and took out a ring, set it carefully in the palm of his other hand, reached back into the pocket and took out a second ring, set it beside the first. He closed his fingers around both of them and put them in his jacket pocket where they would not be in the way. It was such a quiet, ordinary gesture that Chisum almost did not understand what she was watching. But the rest of the market did. She noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure rather than a sound. The vendor at the nearest stall had stopped arranging his display and was standing very still with his back to the aisle. The woman 3 stalls down had stepped in front of her daughter. A delivery man 2 rows over had put his phone face down on a crate and was watching the middle distance. Nobody in the market was moving, in the natural, aimless way people move when nothing is happening. They had all become very interested in not being between 2 specific points. Emeka looked around at all of them. Then he looked back at the man in the plain dark jacket, who was still standing 2 meters away, hands now in his pockets, watching him with an expression that contained nothing at all. In 34 years of life, Emeka Okafor had never once considered that he might walk into a room, or a market, or any space on earth, and discover that he was the only person present who did not know something that everyone else already understood. He was considering it now. He considered it for approximately 6 seconds. Then he released Chisum's wrist. To understand how a man removing 2 rings in a covered market in Mapogu could empty the air out of a crowd that size without raising his voice, you have to understand who Kwon Jae-won was. And to understand why Chisum was in that market at all, you have to go back 6 months, to a woman who arrived in Seoul with 1 carry-on suitcase and a single piece of paper with the address of an apartment a cousin's colleague had agreed to sublet on short notice, with no plan beyond getting on a plane before she changed her mind. In Lagos, the marriage had looked like the right choice from the outside, which was the only angle she had been allowed to show anyone. Emeka Okafor came from a good family and had a position people respected and an apartment in Lekki with a generator that worked. And those things had mattered very much to her mother, who did not know, because Chisum had not told her, that the generator was the most reliable thing in the apartment. It started the way these things apparently always start, small corrections, his voice dropping to that particular tone when she wore the wrong thing, or stayed out past the wrong hour, or laughed too loudly at something he had not found funny. The corrections became requirements. The requirements became consequences. By the 2nd year, she had a spreadsheet in her head of everything that required permission and everything that triggered a consequence, and she maintained it with the same careful diligence she brought to her actual job as a supply chain coordinator, because maintaining it was what kept things manageable. The thing she never found a clean way to explain to anyone afterward was how much energy it took to keep the outside looking ordinary. She had a job she was good at. She had friends she still saw, less often each year, for reasons she framed as being busy rather than being managed. She had a mother who called every Sunday and to whom she said everything was fine because her mother had been so happy at the wedding, and Chisom did not yet understand that telling someone the truth can be an act of love even when it complicates things for them. She was holding so many versions of the story simultaneously that there were months when she could not have told you which version was the true one, and that was, she understood later, the most dangerous part. Not the moments when things escalated, the long stretches when things were manageable, where she talked herself into believing manageable was something close enough to good. The women in her mother's generation had a saying she had grown up hearing: "You do not air family business." She had spent 2.5 years turning that saying over in her mind like a stone, looking for a side of it that helped her. She never found one. The night she left, she had not planned to leave. She had planned 100 times, drafted the steps in her head so many times she could recite them in order, and cancelled every time because there was always a reason the timing was wrong. And the truth was that the plan gave her something to hold on to on the bad nights, and she was not sure she was ready to spend that kind of courage on the actual thing. Then one evening he grabbed her wrist in the kitchen, over a conversation that had barely started, and something that had been stretched tight for 2.5 years simply went past the point where it could hold. And she was at her cousin Adana's flat in Surulere by midnight, with one bag and a lie about a work emergency. Adana helped her. Adana's colleague had a contact in Seoul. It happened faster than anything in Chisom's adult life had ever happened, because she was moving before she could think carefully enough to stop. She found a position doing supply chain work at a small import business in Yongsan, run by a Korean Ghanaian family who had seen enough of the world to ask no unnecessary questions. She learned the transit routes. She learned the neighborhood. She learned which Pojangmacha vendors left their lights on latest, and which building guard on her street nodded when he recognized her. She was building a map of a place she could trust, one point at a time. The first 3 weeks in Seoul she cried every night, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific exhaustion of no longer spending every waking hour calculating. The body apparently saves those feelings for when it has somewhere safe enough to put them. She let it. By the 4th week she was sleeping properly for the first time in years. By the 6th week she had started learning Korean from a notebook she carried in her coat pocket, 30 new words a week, because she had decided early on that the one thing she had wasted in Lagos was how much of herself she had spent on a single person, and she was not going to waste the same amount of herself on fear of a new place. She called her mother on Sundays. She said she had taken a secondment for work, which was not entirely untrue. She did not tell Adana's family that Emeka had been asking where she was, because Adana had done enough, and Chisom was not going to repay that by making her cousin's household a target of his bad temper. She met Kwon Jae-won for the first time, without knowing who he was, which, in retrospect, was the only reason the conversation went the way it did. She had been leaving work late in November, tired enough that she flagged down a car she was certain was a taxi, without looking closely enough. The car stopped. She got in and gave the address of her apartment. Nobody said anything for several blocks. Then the man in the front passenger seat turned partway around and said, very politely, that this was not in fact a taxi. She looked more carefully at the interior and understood immediately that she was correct. She apologized. The man in the back seat beside her said to take her where she was going and did not speak again, and she was so mortified that she did not look at him directly until she was getting out, and she only caught his face for a moment in the interior light before the door closed. She found out 2 days later who owned that car, because Yongsan is a particular kind of neighborhood, and people mention particular kinds of things when they want to explain why certain deliveries go smoothly and certain permits come back stamped faster than makes sense. She did not seek him out after that. She decided the safest course was to assume there was no correct etiquette for having accidentally used the car of the chairman of the Kwan organization as a taxi, and to stay out of his immediate vicinity indefinitely. They met again in January, in a restaurant on the upper floor of a building she was visiting for a supplier meeting, and she did not notice him at the adjacent table until the man across from him made a sound and went very still, and the two men with him did not seem to know what to do. She had taken a first aid course 6 years earlier through her company in Lagos, and she recognized what was happening before the other 3 people at his table did, and she was kneeling beside the man and talking him through it before she had consciously decided to stand up. When the episode passed, and she straightened and finally looked at who was sitting across from the recovered man, she understood why the table had gone so still, while everyone else was moving. What she noticed first, before she placed the face, was the way he was looking at her. Not with the particular measuring quality she had learned to read as precursor to a correction or a consequence. He was looking at her the way you look at something that has surprised you in a way you had not expected to be surprised, and he was not hiding that he was surprised, and the fact that he was not hiding it was itself the thing that surprised her in return. She found out when she got home that the man she had helped was one of his senior advisors, and had a heart condition that everyone in the organization knew about except apparently the people who could have helped him fastest if they had known what to look for. She found out also that Kwon Jae-won had sent a message to the import business by morning, asking for the name of the woman who had intervened, and had been told, because the owners of the import business knew exactly who they were dealing with, everything the business records had on her. Kwon Jae-won looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read. Then he said, "Thank you," and she said, "Of course," and went back to her table, and her supplier meeting happened, and she told herself on the way home that this was simply an unusual week. 3 days after that, she noticed the security pass, a car that went slowly past her building at the same time each morning. Not surveillance exactly, more like the way you leave a window cracked open rather than locked, just to make sure the option exists. She told herself she was imagining it, because she had spent 2.5 years learning to doubt everything she noticed, and that habit took longer to lose than she had given it credit for. She was still not entirely sure she had imagined it when Adana called in February to tell her that Emeka had been asking questions. He had found her eventually, through the specific kind of carelessness that close families make out of love. Adana's youngest sister had posted a photograph on a private account, and the account was private in the way that things are private when you forget that one contact you accepted years ago could still see it. The photograph was of a bowl of Korean street food, with a caption that included the phrase, "Big Sis's new favorite spot," and it was enough, for someone patient and motivated, to narrow a city down to a neighborhood. He arrived in Seoul in March, and checked into a hotel in Itaewon. A man who had worked for Kwon Jae-won for 11 years noticed him by the 3rd day. The background check came back with a Lagos address and a history that, when the full report reached a particular desk on a particular morning, caused the man reading it to set it aside for 30 minutes and then do something he did almost never. He changed his afternoon plans. What the report contained was not what Kwon Jae-won had been expecting. He had expected, from the initial description of a man watching a woman's building, something ordinary and ugly. What he got was something that told him exactly how long it had taken for Chisholm to get out of Lagos, and exactly what kind of determination it had required. And he read it with the specific stillness of a man who has spent a long time in proximity to people who use power to hurt people who cannot fight back, and who has drawn, over those years, a very clear line inside himself about which side of that he intends to remain on. He did not tell her. He intended to. He told himself he would tell her, when the situation was sufficiently controlled, that the telling would not cause her more fear than it resolved. He was still making that calculation the morning she went to the market. Chisom did not know any of that the morning she went to the market. She knew only that she needed ginger and tomatoes, and that the covered market 3 streets away opened earlier than the supermarket. She had her bag over her shoulder, and her phone in her coat pocket, and she was thinking about a delivery schedule, and whether the Accra route would clear customs by Thursday. She bought a head of garlic at the first stall, and was weighing ginger at the second, when the familiar shape of a man at the edge of her peripheral vision stopped being part of the crowd and became something specific. She was already moving by the time he said her name. She already knew, by the time the market had gone quiet and Emeka had released her wrist, that Kwon Jae-won had arrived earlier than coincidence could account for. Nobody walks through a covered market in Mapogu at that hour, with no bag and no purchase, unless they are already there for a different reason. She did not ask him about it in front of the men who materialized from the crowd, when Emeka stepped back, calm as people are calm when they have rehearsed the choreography of a situation many times without needing to perform it. She did not ask while Emeka was escorted away, efficiently and without incident, by two men whose posture communicated so clearly that resistance would be both futile and embarrassing, that Emeka did not attempt it. She stood in the market for a moment after he was gone, and simply breathed, which felt like something her body was doing independently of any decision she had made about it. 6 months of mornings where she had stood at her kitchen window and told herself that she was safe now, that safe was a thing she had earned and was allowed to keep, and it had taken him 30 seconds to collapse all of it into that old reflex, that old calculation of exits and distances. She was angrier about that than she was about anything else, and she let herself be angry about it, because anger was considerably easier to stand inside than the alternative. Then she looked at the man in the plain dark jacket, who was waiting quietly a polite distance away, and she asked him directly. When the market had returned to its ordinary noise, and they were standing alone near the ginger stall, she asked it the way she asked most things now, directly. "How long did you know he was in Seoul?" Kwon Jae-won looked at her for a moment. "Since the 4th day." She did not speak for several seconds. "You should have told me. You would have asked me to stop." "I still might." He looked at her steadily, and said nothing, in a way that communicated he had already accepted that consequence before he made the choice anyway. She looked at the ginger on the stall beside her. "What happens to him now?" "The immigration office has a report. He entered on a tourist visa and violated the conditions. There is also the matter of the settlement terms he broke by crossing an international border to pursue you. His lawyers will have a complicated few months." She absorbed this. "Not your lawyers. The firm I use and the firm representing the case have different letterheads. He will be dealing with Korean immigration and a civil claim. My name does not appear in either." She thought about the man who had spent 2 years making her feel that the only power she would ever have was whatever he decided to leave her, and the man beside her, who had apparently spent 3 months arranging quietly for the law to reach Emeka before anything else needed to. "I still needed to know," she said. "Yes," he said, "you did. I am telling you now." It was not an apology exactly. It was something more difficult than an apology. It was an acknowledgement that she was right, and he had made a choice, and both things were true at the same time, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. She bought the ginger and the tomatoes. He walked her home without being asked, and without making it into anything, and when they reached her building, he stopped at the door, and she said, "I will tell you if I change my mind about the watching," and he said, "All right," and that was where they left it. A month later, she had not changed her mind. He had not stopped either, though the car now went past at a different hour, so she could more easily pretend not to notice. He came to the import office occasionally, always with a reason that was plausible and never quite sufficient. The 3rd time he came, she took a small ceramic bowl from the shelf near the door and set it on the reception desk without saying anything. He looked at it for a moment. Then he removed his rings and set them in the bowl, and she let him in, and they talked about the Accra route and whether it would clear customs by Thursday, and she made tea, and it was the most ordinary and the best hour she had spent in longer than she could calculate. He put the rings back on when he left. He came back the following week and the week after that. She had left the bowl on the desk. He placed the rings in it without being asked, each time, without comment, the way you observe a custom that has become simply what is done. She had not told him yet what it meant to her, a man choosing of his own accord to set down the part of himself that cleared rooms, when he came to sit at her table. She thought he already knew. She thought that was, in fact, precisely why he kept doing it. She thought about it sometimes in the evenings after closing. at a small work table near the window where she kept a notebook for delivery schedules, and sometimes for other things. The bowl by the door, the man who set his rings in it, the version of herself that had arrived 6 months ago with one suitcase and a piece of paper with an address, who had not yet understood that a city could quietly arrange itself, if you gave it enough time, and did not force it, into something that felt like the beginning of safe. She was not all the way there yet, but she was no longer counting exits.